Hey, what up? Hello, and thank you for joining me today on our catching up segment here on the Tonic podcast. I'm Alex Kapitko, joining you guys from my home here in Northern California. I don't think I've gotten a haircut since I shaved my head back in April when I was running half marathons in my basement in Spain. I'm kind of kidding, but not really. But yeah, we're here, August, kind of heading towards the end of the summer. Unfortunately, coronavirus is still going on, and today on Catching Up, I want to try something different. Basically, what I want to do is do a reaction video to Trump's interview from last night with Jonathan Swan from Axios. I think there were parts that came out about a week ago, but the main stuff came out last night, and it was interesting to say the least. And I want to kind of dive into not all parts of it, but some of my biggest takeaways. And ironically, I think that this interview had some very telling information about where Trump is, where the nation's at, and kind of where he's at politically, say if he were to get reelected. So, first off, I guess I just want to go about saying that this interview really wasn't that different from a lot of his current interviews. You know, he talked about how great he's done for black people, how great his response to coronavirus is, blaming China, blaming Democrats, blaming Hillary for not conceding, even though she did in the 2016 election. So, a lot of the same old, but I do think this interview really made Trump look bad. Like, I'm just going to put it out there. I think it made him look bad. And so, yeah, we're just going to start off, and I'm just going to go through. I would say the interview is kind of split into 4 or 5 parts, and I kind of want to just go a little bit into each one of those parts. So, the first part of the interview was about the coronavirus response. And Jonathan Swan went out and just asked Trump why his message is always so rosy, why he's always so optimistic. You know, the numbers are going down, we're testing more, you know, it's just a little bit of a flu. So he asked Trump about that. And this kind of started off the interview and kind of started off the whole narrative. And to me, this kind of reaffirmed what a lot of us have been seeing for a while, that there really is a tale of 2 narratives, right? Going on between what Trump and many Republicans think and then what is actually happening. And so let's start with this clip where Trump tries to explain his side of what's happening right now. And I really do see that there's just this disconnect in narrative. So yeah, let's just see what happens there.
I understand what you're saying, that people need to hear positive thinking. But, you know, for the past 5 months, it's been the virus is totally under control and the cases have been going up and the deaths have been going up.
Look.
But you've been saying it's under control.
Nobody knew what this thing was all about. This has never happened before. 1917, but it was a totally different, it was a flu in that case, okay? But other than 1917, there's never been anything like this. And by the way, if you watch the fake news on television, they don't even talk about it. But you know, there are 188 other countries right now that are suffering, some proportionately far greater than we are.
Yeah, so there's that. And to be honest, I don't really want to focus too much on this, but you know, I think we see a common trend out of this clip where Trump is kind of playing the victim card. He talks about how no one knew what the virus was. Of course no one knew what the virus was. It's a novel coronavirus. The whole world was scrambling to deal with this. That's my issue, is that it's not like everyone knew about it except for Trump. But that's kind of the narrative he plays, you know. It's this conspiratorial narrative where the whole world seems to have the resources, but he was left in the dark and we need to give him some sympathy. That's why he's a president. Presidents aren't supposed to be experts on everything. That's why they listen to the experts while maintaining a positive but serious message. And I think Trump has tried to add a false positive message without any expert opinion and kind of actually breaking away from the experts. And that's my part. That's my big issue with this. So now stick with me for this next part. It's a little bit longer, but I think it really helps highlight more of this disconnect between what Swan's questions are and what Trump's answers are. Trump is concerned about the death as a proportion of cases, but Swan is more concerned about death as a proportion to the population. And this is where the interview gets interesting, because you see Trump pull out these giant graphs saying, we're number 1, you know, we're doing great. And Swan's like, yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, our deaths to positive cases are not awful, but we have over 150,000 people dead. And that's that disconnect. So let's watch here and see what happens.
Death is going up now. Okay, and it's 1,000 a day.
If you look at death...
Yeah, it's going up again.
Let's look.
Daily death.
Take a look at some of these charts.
I'd love to.
We're going to look.
Let's look.
And if you look at death per
started to go up
Here's
again.
one. Well, right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than
We're
the
lower
world?
than
What is that?
Europe.
In what?
Look.
In what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad.
Well,
Much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
you can't do that. You have
Why
to go.
can't I do that?
You have to go by. You have to go by where. Look, here is the United States. You have to go by the cases. The cases.
Why
of
not
death.
as a proportion of
when we have
population?
somebody, what it says is when you have somebody that
Yeah.
has where there's a case.
Oh, okay.
The people that live
Sure.
from
Oh.
those cases.
It's surely a relevant statistic to say if the US has X population and X percentage of death of that population
No,
versus
because you have
South
to
Korea.
go by the.
So I really do love it when Trump pulls out that graph and says, we're doing better than the world. And Swan's like, yeah, what does that even mean? But I think this does show like kind of the issue here is that I think in Trump's head we are doing okay because, I mean, let's be honest, the US does have a lot of tests. And now we could debate the efficacy of these tests and the quickness of these tests because it's not great. But it is true that the US is doing a lot of tests. I mean, we have a lot of people and we have a lot of tests. But the problem is that a lot of people are testing positive and dying. And that is higher in the United States than around the world. And that's what Swan is trying to talk about. And Trump seems to only care about deaths to reported cases. And yeah, I mean, I think every country is going to have a pretty similar stat for that, but the US has a much higher one when you look at our overall population and deaths. And to me, it's kind of worrying that our leader doesn't seem to get that, okay, I mean, yeah, we're testing, but still significantly higher amounts of people are dying. And so that's where I have the issues here. And I feel like Trump doesn't like to listen to facts because I mean it's a known fact. South Korea has only like 300 deaths. And that's insane considering that it's a pretty big country near China. And I think that's what Swan's trying to get at, but Trump just really can't see the forest through the trees in this issue. And I'm going to move on from coronavirus in this meeting because honestly they don't really accomplish much, but I do think Swan does a good job of exposing kind of where the divide is. So I'm going to go on to the Taliban in Russia because that's the next part they talk about. And I think it was late June or early July where the reports were finally coming out about basically the Russian intelligence were giving bounties to the Taliban if they killed American intelligence and American troops. And Trump met with Putin in mid-July, and I guess this never came up. And so Swan kind of presses him on this, and he's like, hey man, like, you were talking with Putin. Why wouldn't this come up? I mean, this is literally incentivizing terrorists to kill American troops. And there just seems to be no, like that light doesn't seem to go on in Trump's head. And it's an unfortunate trend with Trump is that he will go around a fucking city or he'll go around the bush to defend Russia no matter what. And it's kind of strange. So I want to play this clip here where he basically takes out of context historical events to justify why he didn't talk to Putin about this. I don't really know, but I'm curious to know what you guys think.
The reason I say this is even if you don't believe this particular piece of intelligence, and there is dispute, no doubt there is dispute in the intelligence community about it, your former, John Nicholson, former head of forces in Afghanistan, said, and this is when he was working for you, that Russia is supplying weapons to the Taliban. Isn't that enough to challenge Putin over the killings of US soldiers?
Well, we supplied weapons when they were fighting Russia too. You know, when they were fighting with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
It's a different era.
Well, I'm just saying, yes.
But does that? How does that affect?
I'm just saying we did that too.
But how does that?
I don't know. I didn't ask Nicholson about that. He was there for a long time. Didn't have great success because he was there before me, and then ultimately I made a change.
So this part just honestly just leaves me speechless almost. It's a ridiculous response. He not only seems underinformed in something that I think is quite a crucial national security issue, but he equates Russians arming the Taliban right now to kill American troops to when the US armed Pakistan and the Mujahideen in the 1980s during the Cold War. And I mean, I get it that no one's perfect and we all do things like this, but this is such a weird false equivalence. And I think it highlights one of the biggest issues with Trump is that he seems to read the World Almanac, but he kind of misses the background information that actually covers the event. Like, I just don't understand what his point is here. Yeah, we did get involved in a pretty shady, clandestine situation in Afghanistan in the 80s. But that still doesn't justify the Russian government allowing the Taliban to kill U.S. troops. I mean, that is an act of war. And I don't really know if he just didn't read the briefs. I just really don't know. Now, this next part of their discussion on kind of the Middle East, Russia, the Taliban, Afghanistan, Syria, etc., is nothing really too big. But again, it shows the disconnect. Swan asked Trump if by election day he's going to fulfill his promise on basically getting rid of our troops out of Afghanistan and Syria. And Trump talks about how he has, cut the troops by half. But Swan's like, that kind of makes you the same as Obama, just continuing a crisis. And you criticized him for this. So let's take a look.
Election day, how many American troops will be in Afghanistan?
Probably anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000.
That's almost as many as when you came into office.
No, it's not.
8,000.
We had much more. We had a lot of people over there, too.
8,800.
A lot of people. And we did a good job. We wiped out ISIS.
Have you thought about going down to zero?
Now, trust me, if I was making longer segments, I could really go into this a lot. But for the sake of time, I want to get into the next part, kind of part 3 of the interview, which is the upcoming election and mainly mail-in voting. And again, the first part is ridiculous, and I'm not even going to waste our time by showing it. But basically, Swan asked Trump, he's like, hey, you told Fox News that you don't know if you'd accept the election if you lost to Joe Biden or whoever the presumptive nominee is going to be. And Trump's like, well, Hillary didn't concede in 2016, so who knows? And Swan's like, I mean, she did, and she might have been annoying about it and written books and criticized you, but she did concede. And this is just this annoying falsehood that is continually amplified by Trump and all of his sycophants. And it's like, I think Hillary is just as bad as Trump thinks Hillary is, in all honesty, but she did concede. But now the next part I want to talk about is fascinating because I think it highlights why Trump is afraid of voting by mail. And so let's listen because it's interesting. He's asked, you already have a strong vote by mail apparatus on the Republican side. Why don't you want to take advantage of it? And this is his response.
The Republican Party has an extremely well-funded vote by mail program. Your campaign puts out emails telling people to vote by mail.
Correct.
Your daughter-in-law, Lara Trump, she did robocalls in California saying it's safe and secure, mail-in voting.
Let me tell you.
The Republican
we have
won.
no choice.
That was an all mail-in race.
Let me tell you. You ready?
Yeah.
We have no choice because right now we have many court cases that we're waiting. We have one filed in Western Pennsylvania. We have many court cases where we're trying to end it. We went through World War I, you went to the polls, you voted. We went through World War II, you went to the polls, you voted.
You've had mail-in voting since the Civil War.
And now because of the China virus, we're supposed to stay home, send millions of ballots all over the country, millions and millions. You know, you could have a case where this election won't be decided on the evening of November 3rd.
Absolutely.
This election could
What's
be
wrong with that?
decided 2 months later.
It won't be 2 months, but what's wrong with the proper mailing
It could be
count?
decided many months later.
Have you discussed
You know
with-
why? Because lots of things will happen during that period of time, especially when you have tight margins. Lots of things can
Basically
happen.
here, what I've gathered is that Trump isn't actually afraid of the process itself. He points out already that Trump voters vote by mail, and his own campaign has said it's safe and effective. It seems to me that he's afraid of what could happen after, what could happen in between. He seems more worried about the waiting period between getting the results. It's almost like there'd be challenges to him, and Biden wouldn't get those. I don't get it, but he even mentions a lot could happen while we're waiting for the outcome. This is kind of strange, and I hope it's not foreshadowing for what's to come. But I'm not going to stick too long on this, but when Swan asked Trump about Portland and whether Trump thinks these unmarked vehicles detaining people is right, of course he doubles down on his stance of law and order. Quite frankly, I think the stance works and I get it. I'm not really for where these protests have gone in places like CHOP, Chaz, whatever you want to call it. And again, Trump reiterates his stance that some protesters are good, but most are rioters and causing anarchy. And I think this highlights the divide, which could be hard to reconcile. Trump is, infuming this culture war. And now I find it interesting is that when Trump is asked about police brutality and whether there should be an investigation into it, his answer is kind of doubling down on division and the culture war. Like, I want you to listen to this part because I think it really says where he stands on this issue.
I think Antifa should be investigated, not the law enforcement. They're investigating.
They shouldn't be investigating.
Have you been watching television?
I have.
Have you been seeing the violence?
Sure.
And so yeah, I mean, we're basically seeing what I feel like we've been seeing for a long time, is that Trump is kind of demonizing the other side, yet he doesn't really understand the other side. And while I found that part interesting, I also found it interesting that later on, when he was asked if he would meet with any Black Lives Matter leaders to at least see where they stand, maybe find some common ground, here's what he said. So let's take a look.
Mr. President, have you ever met with a Black Lives Matter activist to hear them out, hear their arguments?
Well, Black Lives Matter started off, to me, very badly because it was...
Did you ever meet with one?
Pigs in a blanket, burn them like bacon. That was the first time I ever heard of that was 3-4 years ago. Pigs, meaning policemen. Pigs is what they're referring to, in a blanket, fry them like bacon. I thought it was, so I got off to a bad start. I got off to a very bad start.
Would you meet with a Black Lives Matter activist?
I would, but I think right now
Why haven't you?
When they paint the sign, nobody's asked for a meeting. Nobody's ever asked me for a meeting.
Honestly, this reaction is ridiculous. Like, I personally think that there's parts of Black Lives Matter that have gone too far, and they need to find somewhat of a leader to kind of help incentivize and expedite the message they want to have. But at the same time, Trump is playing the victim again. Oh, they talked poorly about him. Oh, they criticized him. Oh, they criticized the police, and they never reached out to him. He's the damn president, for God's sake. It's his job to be bigger than pettiness. Like, in my opinion, and I'm not really even for the political side of Black Lives Matter, but it's Trump's job as president to reach out to groups like that. It's his job. It starts and ends with him. Now, we're finally getting here to the end of the interview, but I think one of the most interesting parts, and maybe the sleeper part of this, is when they get into police brutality and systematic racism. I don't think Trump really plays dumb in this. I just don't think he really knows enough about the history of racism in the United States. And I want to play about a minute of this answer, so please bear with me, because ironically, Trump uses his own hubris to defend his policies with African Americans, and along the way acknowledges that systematic racism exists.
I got them funding. Obama never did it. I did more for the black community than anybody, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln. Whether you like it or not, people say, "Oh, that's interesting."
You believe you did more than Lyndon Johnson, who passed the Civil Rights Act?
I think I did, yeah.
How?
Because I got criminal
possibly
justice reform done. I got prison reform.
Lyndon Johnson.
I've done things.
He passed the Civil Rights Act.
How has it worked out? If you take a look at what Lyndon Johnson did.
You think the Civil Rights Act was a mistake?
How has it worked out? Because frankly, it took a long time. But for African Americans, under my administration, Jonathan, under my administration...
I'm going to call a spade here, and I think you guys saw the same footage I just watched. And I think, weirdly, Trump was so caught up in the cockiness of defending his own presidency with African Americans that he acknowledged that systematic racism exists. Notice he talked about Lyndon B. Johnson and the Civil Rights Act and how not that much changed and how long it took. To me, that sounds like Trump, weirdly enough, circled around and actually admitted that systematic racism exists. I have one more takeaway before we're out of here. And at the end of the interview, Swan asked Trump about the late John Lewis. And, spoiler, we learned that Trump is petty and still has a lackluster understanding of history.
I don't know. I don't know John Lewis. He chose not to come to my inauguration. He chose, I never met John Lewis, actually. I don't believe.
Do you find him impressive?
I can't say one way or the other. I find a lot of people impressive. I find many people not impressive. But I didn't go.
Do you find his story impressive?
He didn't come to my inauguration. He didn't come to my State of the Union speeches. And that's okay. That's his right. And again, nobody has done more for black Americans than I have.
I understand.
He should have come. I think he made a big mistake.
But taking your relationship with him out of it, do you find his story impressive, what he's done for this country?
He was a person that devoted a lot of energy and a lot of heart to civil rights, But there were many others
And
also.
yeah, I mean, honestly, that is one of the worst endings I think you could have for an interview. And I'm not even talking optics. John Lewis was an instrumental person for not only the civil rights movement, but for kind of showing that there's humility. And the fact that I don't think Trump even really knows what John Lewis did and just treats it as a petty, he didn't show up at my inauguration is, it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad, and it makes me worried that our president doesn't even understand the context. I mean, you even had Mitch McConnell paying his dues when John Lewis died, and we're not seeing the same from Trump. And I think it's because he doesn't understand the context of the things he says. So, well, in all, I don't feel too confident in this interview, but I don't think we learned too much. But I wanted to analyze this. I think it was fun. Please let me know your thoughts. I think we have, about 90 days now till the election, and that's why I want to do this. I want to educate my fellow conservatives. Is this the guy you want as president? Please tell me, but you got to be thinking a little bit. Are these answers anything close to good? Because I don't think so, and I think this is not the person that should be running our country. So thank you guys. We'll be back later this week with a full-length episode on our favorite political movies, and for now, peace out. This is the Tonic Accord.